Welcome back to C# development. We're talking about module number 6 right now. This is the 4th video. And in this video, what we're talking about is some more complicated kind of ways to interact with Web API. But before we get into all of that, I kind of want to provide a sort of frequently asked questions answer. So if you look, when you run our SPA app, after we've added the Web API component to it, we get this error right here that essentially says that it doesn't understand where you want it to go. And so why this happens is before we added the Web API component, we had this index.html here. And by default, if there's no global application file, it will go to index.html and essentially treat it as if it was a website, just kind of basic website. Because we have this global startup logic that's been added because we've added the API, that doesn't happen. And so we have no kind of link to tell us where to go to first. Because the startup behavior of the project is actually just to start the Web API listening. So fortunately, you can manually navigate to index.html, and that takes you to where you expect to be. However, if you're debugging or if you're trying to work through some issues or you're trying to get your bearings about where you are in the project, that's not necessarily great because you don't want to have to type that every time. So one piece of advice is if you go to CIS.3 or you go to whatever your project is named, if you go to properties and bring up this screen right here, you can set a start URL, and if you copy this bit out and you put index.html in there, oh, you gotta save it. Oh, apparently it picked up. So in the past, I've had to save it and then run it. But now it understands to go here to start up instead of just the root because we don't have a page associated with the root. So if you've been following along with the videos, you know that last time we talked a little bit about how we replaced this being hard-coded in JavaScript with some server-side code that presents to us the values that are stored in a static class. And those hard-coded values are now stored on the server and not client-side inside of the JavaScript, which is novel for this week. But what you didn't previously see is automatically selecting one of the semesters. And so this is going to be the kind of jumping off point of where we're going next. So if we go back to our semester controller, you're going to notice two new pieces of code in here that weren't in here during the previous video. So previously we only had this thing, and what we were using this to show is essentially that we could store things on the server side instead of storing them on the client, which makes a lot of sense because you don't necessarily want to store models on the client side. You want everybody in the organization or everybody using the application to be able to access the data. You want the data centralized and you want the users to be decentralized. So HTTP GET allows us to interact with the Web API in such a way that we do not pass what's called an HTTP body. So there's nothing in the HTTP request except for essentially a header and the URL. So we have some headers, and if you saw the WPF video about how to use a Web API, you'll remember that there were several of them that were added. The headers and the response are very similar. And so because we don't have a body, basically all we have to kind of interact with the API in terms of data is the URL. And so that's what this thing right here is doing. So we referenced at the end of the last video what's called the URL API The URL API for Web API is the ability to specify parameters inside of the actual URL, and these things are matched to actual literal method parameters that are passed into this get method. So this is really, really nice for things like get by ID method. So what we're going to talk about next week is how to store all of this stuff into a database and kind of keep track of all of it. But this ID is really a primary key in a table somewhere. So this ID is going to be the primary key or the unique identifier for a semester in this case. So it's kind of okay that we send this over the URL. Nobody is going to actually really even understand what it means if they were to see this URL. And so we can easily transmit whatever we want in terms of IDs. And then down here, what we're doing is we're using the link syntax, and we're actually going to do another video in this week about link specifically. But we're using a lambda expression and link, which is first default, to get the specific semester that we care about based on this ID. So we're just using a URL to pass an ID in. That ID is used in our method to grab only that one semester with that ID. And here we're using first or default because we expect these IDs to be primary keys in a database, and we would not expect to have more than one. Okay. So on the client side, in app.js, what I'm doing is immediately after I send an HTTP request to get all of the semesters, I'm sending a separate HTTP request to get the default selected semester. And right now what I'm doing is I am setting that to 1. So I am trying to get the first semester, and that is why when I run my application now, these are numbered 1, 2, and 3, and because I have selected 1, I have the first one automatically selected when the page loads. So I can click around, but if I go and refresh it, I will always default back to fall of 2019. So if I change this thing to be 3, for example, now it defaults to summer 2020, which I have not added any data for. If I change this to 2, and then I refresh, it's now this one instead of this one. So this is a really, really popular use case. So you're trying to not necessarily get all of the values in the table. You're not trying to get the top 100 or the top 1,000. You want a specific entity, and you're going to get that with an ID. Next week, we're going to talk a lot about ID matching and what that means and how you synchronize between a database and the client-side application through the server. But suffice it to say, there are many, many use cases where you're very interested in a specific entity. You have maybe a selector and somebody selected that specific ID, and now you want to go retrieve all the metadata associated with that ID. And this is a very, very popular implementation of that use case. Basically, you're using the URL to pass the value. That value is passed to the server side via this parameter, and then you can do whatever you want to with that value. You can nest these things. You can have however many you want, up to the maximum length of the URL, which is quite a lot. But depending on how much data you're trying to pass over, if it's a string or something, that can get fairly cumbersome. So the question becomes, why would you maybe not want to do that? So let's say that you were trying to do something with a social security number. So HTTPS, if this is a protected site, it's kind of secured by TLS. HTTPS uses TLS that's encrypted point-to-point. So that's all fine as long as the data that's going from the client to the server and from the server back to the client is in the body of the HTTP request or the response. The problem is that, as we talked about before, is GETs don't allow you to have a body. You are only given access to this URL. So what will happen is if you run up Fiddler, for example, and we clear this thing out, you see in plain text that I'm going to API semester get by ID and 2. So if I chose to implement a web API and it surfaced very, very sensitive data, so people's names, their addresses, health conditions, their social security number, birthdays even, you could very easily usurp HTTPS by exposing something in plain text in the URL, which is not a great situation. So the easiest and sort of best practice situation is you don't want to use the URL to pass that data. You actually want to use the body of the HTTP request and response to transmit that data, because the body is going to be encrypted by TLS. So that leads us to HTTP post. So HTTP post requests allow you to send body data in the body of the request, and that data has two main features. The first feature is that it is not shown in clear text in the URL. The second feature is that it can be extremely complicated. So up here, this ID is fine, that's a primitive type, and so it doesn't take very much space. Let's say that I actually wanted to add a new semester. So semester itself, if you remember what it looks like in our database mock, it's just an ID and it's just a name. However, if you had a more complicated model, so for example, the class model that has all of this data on it, has instructors, it has enrollments, it has potentially a syllabus document, which we're going to get to later, that is going to be fairly large. And so what will happen is if you try to send that information through the URL, even if it is not protected data, you will get a JSON blob in the URL, and that blob will exceed the maximum length of the URL. So it is better to put that in the body of the request. So HTTP post has two things you have to think about. One on the client side, one on the server side. So we're going to start on the server side first. This from body part allows you to automatically parse the body of the request to a strongly typed class. So this is something that would traditionally be done through AutoMapper. It would be done through some sort of mapping code. One of the powers of C# and Web API, the library, is you don't have to do any of that. It's automatically handled for you. So simply by selecting or entering the from body decorator on this method parameter, this is going to automatically get sort of translated from a JSON blob into a strongly typed class. We're going to talk about how that could fail in just a second. So if we take on faith that my semester is going to come from the client through this sort of mystery voodoo that we've just talked about, basically the rest of this is fairly easy, right? I'm taking a semester from the method parameter that's being passed in, and I'm literally just adding it to my fake database, which is just a static class that has a list of semesters, and I'm adding my new semester to it. If I look at the client side, and I go down to my add semester JavaScript function, what I'm doing is I am using a post method call, and I am calling the URL that matches this path. So again, we have API/semester, we have add or update, that matches API semester add or update. The new thing on the client side is this data parameter here, or data attribute. So this data attribute can take any piece of JSON you want, and it will pass it over to the server, and as long as the attributes in this JSON blob match the attributes or the properties of this class, it should have an ID and a name, you will automatically get the strongly typed class on the server side. So you have nothing between this piece of code and the JavaScript piece of code that's actually doing the call. So what's going to happen is we're going to realize that the controller, this is actually an HTTP post, so it matches this post. The URL route parameters match. The data is going to specify this selected semester, and because I have this from body decorator here, it is going to look in the body of the HTTP request. It's going to parse that automatically to a semester object, or an instance of a semester class, and then it's going to add it to my list. So if we run up a new instance of this thing, we can put a breakpoint at 32. We can hit add a new one. We can call this fall 2020. We can hit OK. And now suddenly on the server side code, so remember this C# does not exist on the client, this is on the web server. And if I look at the semester, indeed I have ID and name, and this is the data that's being passed over from the new values. So then I can continue. Now I'm in the add or update success callback. So remember, there's a success and there's a failure. Right now I'm not handling the failure, but in the success, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add it to my new value. And so now what I have is I'm adding this new semester. If I continue through that, I will see now I have fall 2020. The interesting thing though is when we had just hard-coded this stuff in JavaScript, if I refreshed this page, what would happen is I would reload the JavaScript and then I would lose fall 2020. But if I reload this, what's happening is I'm going back to my get method. I'm going into the semester controller and going back to get. I'm going to db mock semesters. Then I just added my new semester to this db mock. So now this stuff is all server side. When I refresh my client has no idea what is hosted server side. I'm literally using this static class as an instance store, and until I close that process down, I spin the web server, the fake web server hosted in IIS down, and I relaunch it, that static class will continue to hold however many new semesters I add. So now that I've refreshed the server-side code, I don't have fall 2020 anymore. And so if I add fall 2020, I remove that breakpoint. I remove this breakpoint. And then I could also add spring 2021. And I can add summer 2021, so on and so forth ad infinitum, and I could refresh, and I'm going to continue to have all of those added because my static class doesn't lose state on the server. So this gives you an idea of the two additional ways you can use Web API. One is still kind of a fetch-based thing. It's a GET request, doesn't have a body, but it can pass data, and the way that it passes data is through the URL. And then you also have HTTP post, and if we look really quick, capture traffic. We want to add a fall 2021. Okay. Notice that this add or update does not have the values here. And then if you look at the JSON in the body of this request, I do see my JSON that I would expect. So this is being passed in the body, and the reason it's being passed in the body is because I am using a post. So I hope that that is mildly helpful and kind of illustrates the gambit of kind of things that we can do with Web API. I think I will cut it off there. So next time what we're going to do is we're going to look a little bit at Link and all the kind of more complicated stuff that we can do with Link in preparation for preparing this project for next week's module, which is where we get rid of DVMock in favor of Entity Framework sitting on top of a Microsoft SQL Server instance. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is I'm going to post this code. If you're interested in making sure that you understand what's going on and you kind of want to get a little bit of practice before I post the assignment, which is going to be fairly involved, what I would do is I would create a course controller, and I would try to do the exact same thing for courses that I've done in these videos for semesters. Make sure that you can find all of the classes for a semester, and do that with a Git. You're going to have to find an intelligent way of doing that. I suggest using this style of method, and make sure that you can add a new class. And I'll post a solution to that a little bit later in the week, just to give you kind of a hands-on experience with the tools. So thanks very much, and I'll see you in the next video, and it'll be a little bit of a break from this, more on the Link side of things, so you can get prepared for actually manipulating data on the server side. So thanks very much, and I will see you in the next video.